Hey Goji, like I said, I was gonna type a response, and then I thought, well, why not just make a short video instead? Save some time typing. So I think you ask a really good question about, how does God define good and evil? I think one way to think about it is that God created everything. Like He created the world, He created us, He created, the laws of physics, the laws of nature. He created love, He created everything. So he knows what is best. So you can almost say what is good or right is what God says is good or right, and what is wrong is what he tells us, not to do. Because he's the one that made everything, right? He knows far more than any of us what is right and what is wrong. So I know that's kind of a not a very specific answer, just saying, okay, whatever God says, because he's good and right. And maybe a helpful way to think about that is like, imagine a parent. Now, parents are not perfect in many ways, but imagine you do have a parent who is always perfectly loving, perfectly wise, and knows and wants what's best for his children. I think in many ways that's God. He knows what's best for us. He wants what's best for us. So what he tells us to do, we know is the good and right thing to do. Um, so I think so. That's I'd say the big picture of what is right and wrong. To get a little more specific, you read things like the Ten Commandments. Do not kill, do not steal, do not lie, do not commit adultery, do not worship other gods. Um, you read that. You read some of the Jewish Old Testament law, which they had hundreds of laws. But really, all that can be summarized in one thing: love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's really about loving God and and loving others. And I think with loving God, it's a big part of it is trusting God, trusting that He is good, that He wants what's best for you, that giving Him the honor He deserves, because He made everything, right? He made us. He's He's the only one who's all powerful, who's all loving, who's totally just, who's totally perfect in everything. So it's loving Him, and also then loving other people, caring for other people. Um, it's interesting that when you look at read the Old Testament, one thing you'll find is that Jewish people often failed to do those two things. They didn't always trust God that He'd protect them, that He'd provide for them. So they would worship other gods. Worship other gods related to like food and crops. So come harvest time, instead of just praying to their God, they would pray to other gods. Uh, Politically, the Jewish people didn't always trust God to protect them, so they would make alliances with other nations looking for protection. And they didn't always love one another well. Oftentimes, they took advantage of the poor. They didn't care for the poor. God gave them a great kind of great guidelines and principles of how to care for the poor, like for their nation. And oftentimes they didn't listen. There's one prophet, I forget which prophet said it, but it said something like, "This is what God requires of you: to love mercy and to act justly. It's to do the right thing, to care for people." That's kind of the I guess the next layer, if you will. So I think it's loving God and loving others, and then from that we can see specific commands, like obviously things like not murdering, not stealing, forgiving other people, things like being generous with your time, with your money. So some of these things are, Jesus, he teaches a lot about, you say, what God wants from us. There's some sections of the Bible where he does some really great teaching about forgiveness. He does some great teaching where he shows it's really not even so much about our external actions always, but it's about our heart, where he teaches things like, you know, you've heard it. He says, like, you've heard it said, you should not commit murder. But if you are unjustly angry with your brother, you've committed murder in your heart. Or he says, you've heard it said, you should not commit adultery. But if you look lustfully at a woman who's not your wife, you've committed adultery in your heart. And Jesus does this, I think, to show us what God really wants from us. But also at the same time, it's a reminder that we can't actually do that, at least not always and not perfectly, which is why we need forgiveness, and why Jesus had to die, was for those things. So I would say to answer your question, because it is a great question, it's a very complicated question to think about. What does God want from us? Um, and so, yeah, it's first and foremost trusting that He is good and that what He says, what He commands from us, what He wants from us is the right thing because He created everything. He knows everything. He knows what's best and wants what's best for us. And then thinking about the main idea that it's about loving God and about loving others. And then you can look at some specific things from the Old Testament Jewish law, but really probably what's best is looking at some things that Jesus taught. I think it's some of those commands are really helpful ways to, most helpful ways to apply that concept of loving others and loving God. So yeah, so that's how I define, answer your question. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Again, thought this would be easier than spending a lot of time trying to type.